The rain was coming down hard that Tuesday evening in downtown Chicago. Victoria Chen sat in the back of her black sedan, watching the city lights blur through the rain-streaked windows. Her fingers drummed nervously on her leather briefcase as she checked her phone for the 100th time that day. "We're almost there, Miss Chen," her driver called from the front seat. Victoria nodded but didn't respond. Her mind was racing with numbers, presentations, and what she'd say to convince the Japanese investors to save her company. TechFlow Industries was bleeding money, and this deal was their last hope. 3 years of poor decisions and market changes had brought her once successful software company to the edge of bankruptcy. The restaurant came into view, Alessandro's, one of the most expensive places in the city. Victoria had chosen it carefully. She needed to impress these investors, show them she was serious, professional, and worth their trust. The building looked impressive with its tall glass windows and soft, golden lighting spilling onto the wet sidewalk. "Perfect," she whispered to herself, fixing her hair in the window's reflection. Inside Alessandro's, the atmosphere was exactly what Victoria had hoped for. Soft piano music played in the background while well-dressed customers spoke in hushed tones. Crystal glasses caught the warm light from elegant chandeliers hanging above each table. The smell of expensive wine and perfectly prepared food filled the air. Victoria's assistant had reserved a private corner table that would give them privacy for their important business discussion. She walked through the restaurant, her heels clicking on the polished marble floor, feeling confident in her expensive black suit and designer handbag. At 28 years old, David Washington was finishing up his shift in the restaurant's dining room. He moved between tables with practiced ease, refilling water glasses, taking orders, and making sure every customer felt welcome. Most people saw him as just another waiter, but David carried himself with quiet dignity that came from knowing his own worth. What the customers didn't know was that David's story was far more complex than his current job suggested. Just 6 months earlier, he had graduated from Northwestern University with a master's degree in international business. His thesis on global market trends had earned him recognition from his professors, and he spoke 6 languages fluently, thanks to his diplomat father who had moved their family around the world during David's childhood. But life had thrown him a curveball. The international consulting firm that had offered him a dream job suddenly froze their hiring when their biggest client pulled out. David's student visa was expiring, and he needed to show steady employment while waiting for his work authorization to be processed. Restaurant work wasn't his plan, but it paid the bills and kept him legally in the country while he figured out his next move. David approached Victoria's table with the same professional smile he gave everyone. "Good evening. Welcome to Alessandro's. Can I start you with something to drink while you wait for your party?" Victoria barely looked up from her phone. "Water. Still, not sparkling. And make sure the glasses are actually clean this time." Her tone was sharp, distracted by the pressure of the upcoming meeting. "Of course," David replied politely, though he noticed the unnecessary comment about clean glasses. He'd been working in high-end restaurants long enough to recognize when customers were taking their stress out on the staff. As David walked away to get the water, Victoria's phone buzzed with a text from her assistant. The Japanese investors were running 15 minutes late due to traffic. Victoria felt her stomach tighten with anxiety. Every minute that passed felt like another opportunity for something to go wrong. The restaurant's main door opened, and 3 people in expensive suits entered, shaking rain from their umbrellas. Victoria recognized them immediately from the photos her assistant had sent her. Mr. Yamamoto, the lead investor, was a distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. With him were Ms. Sato, a sharp-looking woman about Victoria's age, and Mr. Fujimoto, a younger man who carried himself with the confidence of someone important. Victoria stood quickly, smoothing down her jacket and putting on her biggest smile. This was it, the moment that would determine whether her company survived or died. "Mr. Yamamoto, Ms. Sato, Mr. Fujimoto," she said, extending her hand with practiced confidence. "Victoria Chen, CEO of TechFlow Industries. Thank you so much for coming out in this terrible weather." The Japanese investor smiled politely and shook her hand. Their English was good, though they spoke with accents that reminded Victoria uncomfortably that she had never bothered to learn any language other than English, despite running a company that wanted to expand internationally. David returned with Victoria's water just as the group was settling into their seats. He quietly placed the glass in front of her and began setting up place settings for the new arrivals. "Good evening," he said warmly to the investors. "Welcome to Alessandro's. Can I get you something to drink while you look over the menu?" Mr. Yamamoto smiled and replied in English, "Thank you. We would like to see your wine list, please." As David walked away to get the wine menu, Victoria launched into her rehearsed opening remarks about how excited she was to discuss their potential partnership. She had practiced this speech dozens of times, but now, sitting across from these important investors, her words felt forced and mechanical. The conversation flowed pleasantly enough at first. Victoria explained her company's software solutions and their plans for expansion into Asian markets. The investors listened politely, asking thoughtful questions and taking notes. But Victoria couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The investors kept glancing at each other and speaking in quick bursts of Japanese that she couldn't understand. David returned with the wine list and stood patiently while Mr. Yamamoto studied it. The investor pointed to a bottle and said something in Japanese to his colleagues. They nodded in agreement. "An excellent choice," David said, surprising everyone at the table. "The 2018 vintage was particularly good. Should I decant it for you?" Victoria blinked in confusion. Had David just understood what they said in Japanese? No, that was impossible. He was probably just guessing based on what wine they pointed to. The IC investors, however, looked genuinely pleased. Ms. Sato said something else in Japanese, and David nodded with understanding before responding in what sounded like fluent Japanese. Victoria felt her face flush with embarrassment and confusion. She prided herself on being in control of every business situation, but suddenly she was completely lost. What were they talking about? Were they discussing the deal? Were they saying something negative about her company? The conversation between David and the investors continued for another moment before David excused himself to get their wine. Victoria tried to regain control of the situation by jumping back into her business presentation, but she could see that the investors were distracted, still smiling about whatever David had said to them. As the evening progressed, Victoria's anxiety grew. Every time the investors spoke to each other in Japanese, she felt more and more left out of her own business meeting. This was supposed to be her moment to shine, to save her company, but instead she felt like an outsider watching conversations she couldn't understand. The weight of everything, her failing company, her employees who depended on her, her own reputation, pressed down on her shoulders. She needed this deal to work, and she was starting to panic that it was slipping away from her before she even had a real chance to present her case. Victoria tried to focus on her presentation, but her hands were getting sweaty as she watched the Japanese investors talking among themselves. They were speaking in their native language again, and she had no idea what they were saying. Were they interested in her proposal? Were they talking about her company? Or worse, were they already planning to reject her offer? She cleared her throat loudly, trying to get their attention back. As I was saying, our software has already proven successful in European markets, and we believe Asia represents our next big opportunity. Mr. Yamamoto nodded politely and turned back to his colleagues. They continued their conversation in Japanese, occasionally glancing at the documents Victoria had prepared. She watched their faces carefully, trying to read their expressions, but their poker faces gave nothing away. Minutes felt like hours. Victoria's company was hemorrhaging money every day, and her board of directors was breathing down her neck. She had promised them this deal would save TechFlow Industries. Her reputation, her career, everything she had worked for over the past 15 years was riding on this one meeting. David appeared at their table again, carrying a small plate of appetizers. "Compliments of the chef," he said with a warm smile. "These are our signature truffle canapés." The investors looked pleased and thanked him. Then Mr. Fujimoto said something in Japanese, and David responded immediately in the same language. They had a brief conversation that made all three investors laugh genuinely for the first time since they'd arrived. Victoria felt her stomach drop. What had David said to them? Why were they laughing? She tried to catch David's eye as he walked away, but he was already moving to another table. The food looks delicious, Victoria said, forcing a smile and trying to steer the conversation back to business. Now, about our revenue projections for the Asian market. But the investors seemed more interested in their conversation with David than in her presentation. Ms. Sato said something to her colleagues in Japanese, and they nodded in agreement. Victoria noticed they kept glancing toward the kitchen where David had gone. The pressure was building inside Victoria's chest like a balloon ready to burst. She had spent weeks preparing for this meeting. She had researched these investors, studied their previous deals, and crafted what she thought was the perfect pitch. But now she was losing them to a conversation she couldn't even understand. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her CFO. Board meeting moved to tomorrow morning. They want to know about the Japanese deal. Please tell me you have good news. Victoria's hands trembled slightly as she put her phone away. She couldn't go back to her board empty-handed. Too much was at stake. David returned to refill their water glasses. As he poured, Mr. Yamamoto asked him something in Japanese. David paused, looking thoughtful, then gave a detailed response that lasted almost a full minute. The investors listened intently, nodding and asking follow-up questions. Victoria watched this exchange with growing frustration and panic. She was the CEO of a successful company, yet she felt completely powerless in this situation. These investors were having important conversations right in front of her, and she was as useful as a piece of furniture. "Excuse me?" Victoria said loudly, her voice cutting through their conversation. The entire table turned to look at her, along with several people at nearby tables. David straightened up, his water pitcher still in hand. "Yes, ma'am? Is there something I can help you with?" Victoria's mind was racing. She needed to regain control of this situation somehow. The investors were clearly more interested in talking to David than listening to her business proposal. Maybe if she could get David to translate for her, she could finally understand what they were really thinking about her deal. "You seem to know their language pretty well," Victoria said, her voice carrying a tone that made other diners look over. "I noticed you've been chatting with my guests here." David maintained his professional smile, though something flickered in his eyes. "I was just making sure they were comfortable, ma'am. Is there anything specific you need?" Victoria felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Her business, her employees' jobs, her own future, everything was slipping away because of a language barrier. She looked at David, seeing only a waiter who happened to speak Japanese, and made a decision that would change everything. "Actually, yes," Victoria said, her voice getting louder with each word. "Since you clearly understand what they're saying, maybe you can help me out here." The investors exchanged glances. Mr. Yamamoto's expression had changed from polite interest to something cooler, more watchful. Ms. Sato stopped eating and put down her fork. Victoria didn't notice their reactions. She was too focused on her own desperation and the solution she thought she'd found. "I mean, if you're so smart that you can have full conversations with international business executives." David's professional smile faltered slightly. He could sense where this was heading, and it wasn't anywhere good. Other servers in the bar restaurant had started to notice the commotion at the table. "Ma'am, I was just being polite to your guests," David said carefully. "If there's something specific you need help with, I'd be happy to assist." But Victoria was past the point of careful consideration. The stress of her failing company, the pressure from her board, and the humiliation of being left out of conversations at her own business meeting had pushed her over the edge. "Don't play dumb with me," Victoria snapped, her voice now loud enough that half the restaurant was listening. "You obviously speak their language fluently. You've been having conversations with them all evening while I'm sitting here like an idiot." The Japanese investors were no longer trying to hide their disapproval. Mr. Fujimoto whispered something to his colleagues, and their expressions grew increasingly serious. David set down the water pitcher and clasped his hands behind his back, a gesture that somehow made him look more dignified despite wearing a server's uniform. "I understand you're having an important business meeting," he said quietly. I don't want to interfere with that. But you already are interfering. Victoria's voice cracked with frustration. They're more interested in talking to you than listening. To my proposal. The restaurant had grown noticeably quieter. Even the soft piano music seemed to fade into the background as other diners turned to watch the scene unfolding at Victoria's table. Victoria stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. She was beyond caring about appearances now. All she could think about was how this waiter seemed to have more influence over her potential investors than she did. You know what? Victoria said, pointing her finger at David. If you're so smart, if you can speak their language so well, then why don't you just translate everything they've been saying? David remained perfectly still, his expression calm but his eyes reflecting a deep sadness that Victoria was too angry to notice. Tell me what they really think about my company, Victoria demanded. Tell me what they've been discussing behind my back in their secret little conversations. The word secret hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Mr. Yamamoto slowly placed his napkin on the table and looked directly at Victoria for the first time since her outburst began. Victoria finally realized that the entire restaurant was watching her, but she was too far gone to back down now. She had painted herself into a corner, and pride was the only thing keeping her standing. The silence in the restaurant was deafening. Victoria stood there, breathing heavily, her finger still pointing at David like she was accusing him of a crime. Every eye in Alessandro's was focused on their table, and she could feel the judgment from dozens of strangers. David looked at Victoria for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression. The polite, deferential mask he wore as a server began to fall away, replaced by something much more complex. He wasn't angry exactly, but there was a quiet dignity in his posture that made Victoria suddenly feel very small. You want to know what they've been saying? David asked, his voice calm and measured. Are you sure about that? Victoria's confidence wavered for just a second, but her desperation pushed her forward. Yes, I want to know. I have a right to know what's being discussed at my own business meeting. David nodded slowly, then turned to face the Japanese investors. When he spoke, his voice transformed completely. The words that came out of his mouth were fluid, perfect Japanese, spoken with the confidence of someone who had been using the language his entire life. Yamamoto-san, Sato-san, Fujimoto-san, David began, bowing slightly in the traditional manner. Please forgive this interruption. The lady would like me to translate your earlier conversation. Victoria's mouth fell open. The Japanese that flowed from David's lips was nothing like the broken, hesitant foreign language attempts she was used to hearing from her American colleagues. This was the real thing. Natural, sophisticated, completely native sounding. Mr. Yamamoto's eyebrows rose in surprise and he responded in rapid Japanese. David listened carefully, nodding, then turned back to Victoria. Mr. Yamamoto says he's impressed by my language skills, and he's curious about my background, David translated. He wants to know where I learned to speak Japanese so well. Victoria felt her legs go weak. She slowly sat back down in her chair, staring at David as if she was seeing him for the first time. This wasn't just a waiter who knew a few phrases. This man was genuinely fluent. David continued his conversation with the investors, switching effortlessly between English and Japanese. He explained that he had lived in Tokyo for 3 years when his father worked at the American Embassy, and that he had studied East Asian languages in college. Ms. Sato leaned forward, clearly intrigued, and asked David several questions in rapid Japanese. David answered each one thoughtfully, and Victoria watched in amazement as the 3 investors became more and more engaged in their conversation with him. What are they saying now? Victoria whispered, her earlier anger replaced by a growing sense of dread. David paused his conversation with the investors and looked at Victoria. Ms. Sato was asking about my education and work experience. She's interested in knowing why someone with my qualifications is working as a waiter. Before Victoria could respond, David turned back to the investors and continued speaking in Japanese. His explanation was detailed and sincere, and Victoria could see the investors nodding with what looked like respect and understanding. Then something happened that made Victoria's blood run cold. Mr. Fujimoto pulled out his business card and offered it to David. The two men exchanged cards with the formal ceremony that Victoria recognized from her business etiquette training, but which she had never actually witnessed in person. "He's giving you his business card?" Victoria asked weakly. "Yes," David replied simply. "Mr. Fujimoto runs an international consulting firm. He's interested in my background in international business and my language skills." Victoria felt like the world was tilting underneath her. Not only was her waiter more qualified than she had imagined, but he was now networking with her potential investors right in front of her. Mr. Yamamoto spoke again, this time looking directly at Victoria as he spoke in Japanese. His tone was serious, almost formal, and Victoria could tell from his expression that whatever he was saying wasn't good news for her. "He wants me to translate what they were discussing earlier about your business proposal," David said quietly. Victoria's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. And what were they saying? David looked uncomfortable for the first time since the confrontation began. "Ma'am, are you certain you want to hear this? Some of it might be difficult to listen to." "Just tell me," Victoria said, though her voice barely came out as a whisper. David took a deep breath. "They were saying that your financial projections look promising and your software has potential in the Asian market. They were genuinely interested in your proposal." Victoria felt a brief moment of relief, but David's expression told her there was more. "However," David continued, "they were also discussing their concerns about your company's leadership and cultural awareness. They believe that how a business leader treats service workers and local staff reveals their true character." The words hit Victoria like a physical blow. She looked at the three investors who were watching her with expressions that had grown noticeably cooler since her outburst began. "They were testing me?" Victoria asked, the realization dawning on her slowly. "Not intentionally," David replied, "but they notice everything." Mr. Yamamoto told his colleagues that in their culture, respect for all people regardless of their position is fundamental to good business relationships. Victoria felt sick to her stomach. Everything she had worked for, everything she had built was crumbling because she had treated a waiter poorly. But David wasn't finished. "There's more," he said gently. "They were also impressed by the diversity of your staff, which they notice from your company materials. They value businesses that embrace people from different backgrounds and treat everyone with dignity." The irony was crushing. Victoria's company actually had excellent diversity policies on paper, and she had been proud of their inclusive hiring practices. But in this moment, when it mattered most, she had revealed her own personal biases. Mr. Yamamoto spoke again, and David listened carefully before translating. "He says that they've seen enough to make their decision about the partnership." Victoria's hands were shaking now. "And what's their decision?" David hesitated, clearly not wanting to be the messenger for what was obviously bad news. "They're going to pass on the investment opportunity. They don't believe your company would be a good cultural fit for their organization." The words echoed in Victoria's mind like a death sentence. Her company was finished. Her employees would lose their jobs. Her reputation in the business world would be destroyed. But Mr. Yamamoto wasn't done speaking. He continued in Japanese for several more minutes, occasionally gesturing toward David. Victoria watched helplessly as her former potential investors had an animated conversation with her waiter about something she couldn't understand. Finally, David turned back to Victoria with an expression of amazement on his face. "Mr. Yamamoto has offered me a position with their consulting firm. They have offices in Tokyo, New York, and London, and they need someone with my language skills and educational background." Victoria stared at David, then at the investors, then back at David. In the span of one evening, she had lost a multi-million-dollar deal and watched her waiter get offered what was probably her dream job. "The salary they're offering, David," continued quietly, "is more than I ever imagined I could earn." Victoria felt like she was watching her life collapse in slow motion, while someone else's dreams came true right in front of her. Victoria sat frozen in her chair, watching her entire world crumble while David's life was about to change forever. The Japanese investors were still talking excitedly with him, completely ignoring her presence at what was supposed to be her own business meeting. She tried to process what had just happened. In less than 10 minutes, she had lost a deal worth millions of dollars and witnessed her waiter get offered what sounded like an incredible job opportunity. The worst part was knowing that it was entirely her own fault. David was writing something on a napkin, probably his contact information for the investors. Victoria watched his hands move with the same careful precision he had shown when serving their table. Everything about him was professional, educated, dignified. How had she been so blind? Her phone buzzed with another text message. This time, it was from her assistant. Board members asking for updates, press conference scheduled for tomorrow to announce the Japanese partnership. Should I confirm? Victoria stared at the message, her hands trembling. What was she going to tell her board? What was she going to tell the press? How could she explain that she had single-handedly destroyed the deal that was supposed to save her company? Mr. Yamamoto stood up from the table, followed by his colleagues. They shook hands formally with David, bowing slightly in the traditional Japanese manner. Victoria realized they were preparing to leave without even saying goodbye to her. "Wait," Victoria said, her voice cracking. "Please, can we talk about this? I know I made a mistake, but surely we can work something out." The three investors turned to look at her, their expressions polite but distant. Mr. Yamamoto spoke briefly in English, his accent thick but his words clear. "Ms. Chen, we appreciate the time you spent preparing your presentation. Your company's software is impressive and your financial projections show promise." Victoria felt a tiny spark of hope. Maybe there was still a chance to salvage this situation. But Mr. Yamamoto continued, and his next words crushed that hope completely. "However, we have learned what we needed to know about your leadership style and company culture. We must respectfully decline your partnership proposal." "But you don't understand," Victoria said desperately, standing up so quickly that her chair nearly fell over. "I was just stressed about the meeting. That's not how I normally treat people. My company has excellent diversity policies. We treat all our employees fairly." Ms. Sato interrupted her gently, but firmly. "Ms. Chen, we did not make this decision lightly. In our business culture, we believe that how a person treats others when they are under pressure reveals their true character. Tonight, we saw your true character." The words hit Victoria like a slap in the face. She looked around the restaurant and realized that other diners were still watching their table, still listening to every word of this humiliating conversation. "Please," Victoria begged, her voice barely above a whisper. "My company is struggling. I have 200 employees who depend on their jobs. This deal could save all of them." David, who had been quietly listening to this exchange, stepped forward. "Mr. Yamamoto, if I may," he said respectfully. "Perhaps there's a way to separate the business opportunity from personal issues." Victoria looked at David with surprise and desperate gratitude. Was he actually trying to help her after everything she had done? But Mr. Yamamoto shook his head sadly. "Young man, we appreciate your generous spirit, but our decision is final. We invest, not just in businesses, but in partnerships. We must trust the people we work with, and trust is built on respect and character." He turned back to Victoria. "Your waiter has shown more professionalism and dignity in the past hour than we have seen from many business executives. He treated us with respect even while being treated poorly himself. That tells us everything we need to know about both of you." Victoria felt tears starting to form in her eyes. The humiliation was complete. She had been judged and found wanting, not just as a business leader but as a human being. Mr. Fujimoto, who had been quiet for most of the evening, finally spoke up. "David, we meant what we said about the job offer. We would be honored to have someone of your qualifications and character join our team." David bowed slightly. "Thank you, sir. I'm very interested in discussing this opportunity further." "Excellent," Mr. Fujimoto replied. "We'll be in Chicago for 2 more days. Perhaps we can meet tomorrow to discuss the details." As the investors prepared to leave, Victoria made one last desperate attempt to change their minds. "Wait, please. What if I donate money to charity? What if I take sensitivity training? What if I publicly apologize? There must be something I can do to fix this. Mr. Yamamoto paused at her table, his expression softening slightly. Ms. Chen, we do not doubt that you could learn from this experience, but business partnerships require trust from the very beginning. Once that trust is broken, it is very difficult to rebuild. He glanced at David, then back at Victoria. Perhaps this young man could teach you something about respect and humility. He has much wisdom for someone so young. The investors left, the restaurant taking Victoria's last hope with them. She slumped back into her chair, staring at the untouched food on her plate. Around her, the restaurant slowly returned to normal as other diners went back to their own conversations. David began clearing the table, his movements efficient and professional despite everything that had just happened. Victoria watched him work, seeing him clearly for the first time all evening. You have a master's degree, she said quietly. It wasn't a question. Yes, David replied without looking up from the plates he was stacking. In international business. Yes. And you speak 6 languages. 7, actually, David corrected gently. I learned Mandarin last year. Victoria felt another wave of shame wash over her. Here was someone who was more qualified than most of her own employees, and she had treated him like he was beneath her notice. Why didn't you tell me? She asked. David finally looked at her directly. When would I have told you? When you ordered your water without looking at me? When you complained about clean glasses? When you demanded that I translate for you? His words weren't angry, just matter of fact, which somehow made them hurt even more. You tried to help me at the end, Victoria said. Why? David finished clearing the table before answering. Because everyone deserves a second chance, because your employees shouldn't suffer for your mistakes, and because I know what it's like to be judged by appearances rather than qualifications. Victoria's phone rang. It was her CFO, probably calling for an update on the meeting. She stared at the phone until it stopped ringing, then looked back at David. What am I going to do? She whispered, more to herself than to him. David removed his apron and folded it neatly. His shift was over, and apparently, so was his time as a waiter. That's something you'll have to figure out for yourself, Ms. Chen. But maybe start by asking yourself why you assumed I couldn't be educated just because I was serving your table. He walked toward the restaurant's back room to collect his things, leaving Victoria alone with the wreckage of her career and the bitter taste of her own prejudices. Victoria sat alone at the table for what felt like hours, though it was probably only 20 minutes. The restaurant had returned to its normal rhythm around her, but she felt completely disconnected from the world. Her untouched food had grown cold, and her water glass sat empty, forgotten. Her phone had been buzzing constantly with calls and texts from her board members, her assistant, and her CFO. She couldn't bring herself to answer any of them. What would she say? How could she explain that she had destroyed her company's last hope because she couldn't control her own prejudices? Finally, she forced herself to pick up the phone and call her CFO, Robert. He answered on the first ring. Victoria, thank God. How did the meeting go? Please tell me we have good news. Victoria's throat felt tight. Robert, we need to talk. Can you cancel the press conference for tomorrow? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Cancel it? Why? What happened? The Japanese investors said no. The deal is off. What do you mean they said no? Your presentation was perfect. We went over it a dozen times. What went wrong? Victoria closed her eyes, trying to find the words. I went wrong, Robert. I made a terrible mistake, and now it's over. She could hear Robert taking a deep breath, trying to stay calm. Okay, let's not panic. Maybe we can reach out to them tomorrow, see if there's room for negotiation. There's no room for anything, Victoria interrupted. They made it very clear that they don't want to work with us, with me. The silence on the phone stretched on until Robert finally spoke again. Victoria, what exactly happened in that restaurant? Victoria told him everything. About the investors speaking Japanese, about her frustration and panic, about David the waiter who turned out to be more qualified than she had ever imagined. She told him about her outburst, about demanding that David translate. about how the investors had witnessed her treating their server with disrespect and contempt. When she finished, Robert was quiet for a long time. Finally, he spoke, and his voice was heavy with disappointment. "Victoria, do you realize what this means? Without this deal, we'll have to start laying off employees within a month. The board is going to demand answers." "I know," Victoria whispered. "I know what I've done." After she hung up, Victoria sat in the empty restaurant watching the staff clean up around her. The manager eventually approached her table, politely asking if she needed anything else or if she was ready for her check. She paid for the meal that no one had eaten and left the restaurant, stepping out into the Chicago night. The rain had stopped, but the streets were still wet and reflective under the streetlights. She walked slowly to her car, her heels clicking on the damp pavement. As she reached her sedan, she heard familiar voices behind her. She turned to see David walking out of the restaurant's employee entrance with a few other staff members. He had changed out of his server uniform into jeans and a casual jacket, and he was laughing at something one of his co-workers had said. For a moment, Victoria considered approaching him, maybe apologizing again or trying to explain herself. But what could she possibly say that would matter now? Instead, she watched from a distance as David said goodbye to his colleagues and walked toward the bus stop. 3 days later, Victoria found herself sitting in her company's conference room, facing her board of directors. The mood in the room was somber, and she could see the disappointment and anger in their faces. "So let me understand this correctly," said Margaret, the board chair, her voice carefully controlled. "You destroyed our relationship with potential investors because you treated a restaurant employee poorly?" Victoria nodded, unable to meet anyone's eyes. "Yes. And this employee turned out to be highly educated and qualified?" "Yes. And he ended up getting a job offer from the same investors who rejected us?" "Yes." The silence in the room was deafening. Victoria had prepared for this meeting, had rehearsed what she would say, but now all her words seemed inadequate. "Victoria," said James, the longest-serving board member, "in 30 years of business, I have never heard of anything like this. How could you let your personal biases interfere with such an important deal?" Victoria finally looked up from the table. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I was under pressure, I was panicking, and I made assumptions about someone based on their job and their appearance. There's no excuse for what I did." "You're right," Margaret said firmly. "There is no excuse. And unfortunately, this isn't just about one failed deal anymore. Word is getting out about what happened. Social media is talking about it. Business reporters are starting to ask questions." Victoria's stomach dropped. She hadn't considered that. The story might spread beyond that one restaurant. "Someone posted a video," Margaret continued. "Apparently, another customer in the restaurant that night recorded part of your outburst. It's been shared thousands of times." Victoria felt the room spinning around her. A video of her demanding that David translate, of her treating him with contempt. She pulled out her phone and searched for her name. The results made her feel sick. There it was, a shaky phone video with the caption, "CEO demands waiter translate for her, doesn't realize he's more qualified than she is." The comments below were brutal. People were calling her entitled, racist, and completely unfit to lead a company. "The damage to our company's reputation is significant," Margaret said. "Our stock price has dropped 15% since the story broke. Some of our existing clients are asking questions about our values and leadership." Victoria put her phone down with shaking hands. "What do you want me to do?" The board members exchanged glances. Margaret spoke for all of them. "Victoria, we've made a decision. We're asking for your resignation, effective immediately." The words hit Victoria like a physical blow, but she realized she had been expecting them. "I understand," she said quietly. "We'll provide a severance package and we'll work with you on a public statement," Margaret continued. "But we need new leadership if this company is going to survive." Victoria nodded, gathering her things. As she prepared to leave the conference room for the last time, she asked, "What about the employees? Will they be okay?" "We're exploring other partnership opportunities," James replied. Robert will take over as interim CEO, and we're hoping to find new investors who can help us stabilize. But I won't lie to you. It's going to be difficult. Victoria left the building that had been her second home for 15 years, carrying a small box of personal items. As she walked to her car, she thought about David. He was probably in his first day at his new job, working with international clients, using his languages and education in ways he had always dreamed of. That evening, Victoria sat in her empty apartment looking at her phone. She had David's contact information from the restaurant's employee directory. After staring at his number for an hour, she finally worked up the courage to send him a text message. David, this is Victoria Chen. I know this doesn't change anything, but I wanted you to know that I'm truly sorry for how I treated you. You were right about everything. I hope your new job brings you all the success you deserve. She sent the message and then sat back, waiting. 20 minutes later, her phone buzzed with a reply. Ms. Chen, thank you for reaching out. I hope you can learn from this experience and treat people better in the future. Everyone deserves to be seen for who they really are, not judged by appearances or assumptions. I wish you the best in finding your way forward. Victoria read the message 3 times, tears streaming down her face. Even in his response, David was more gracious and professional than she had been to him. She had lost everything. Her job, her company, her reputation. But maybe, just maybe, she could still learn to be a better person.